If you want to understand whether a SaaS contract is commercially sane, one of the first places you should look is the limitation of liability clause. Because when things go wrong, this is often the clause that tells you whether the contract still makes economic sense. A lot of people read limitation of liability clauses too quickly. They look for one number, they find the liability cap, and they think they understand the clause. But that is usually not enough. In practice, the limitation of liability clause is rarely just about one cap. It is about the structure of risk in the agreement. It tells you how much exposure each party is carrying, which losses are excluded, which risks sit outside the cap, and whether the economics of the deal remain balanced if the relationship breaks down. So in this video, I want to explain how to read a limitation of liability clause in a SaaS contract like a business-minded legal professional. Not like someone doing a law school exercise, but like someone trying to answer a practical question. If this deal goes badly, how exposed is the company really? That is the real question. The first thing to understand is what the clause is actually doing. A limitation of liability clause is not just a protective clause for lawyers. It is an economic boundary. It is the part of the contract that says, if something goes wrong, here is how far responsibility goes. Here is what kind of damage can be claimed, and here is where the line stops. In SaaS contracts, that matters a lot because the service is ongoing, often business critical, often linked to data, and sometimes integrated into the customer's operations, which means that when disputes arise, the alleged consequences can become much bigger than the subscription fee itself. That is exactly why the clause matters. Without it, the company may be exposed to damages that are completely disproportionate to the value of the deal. So, when I read this clause, I do not just ask, what is the cap? I ask a broader set of questions. What is capped? What is excluded? What sits outside the cap? Is the clause symmetrical? And does the overall structure match the commercial reality of the deal? That is the correct lens. So, let us start with the first thing most people look at, the cap amount. Usually, the clause will say something like liability is limited to the fees paid under the agreement over the previous 12 months. Sometimes, it is the fees paid or payable over 12 months. Sometimes it is the total fees paid under the contract. Sometimes it can be a fixed amount. These differences matter. Fees paid in the previous 12 months is often more supplier friendly, is an ongoing SaaS relationship because it keeps the cap connected to the recent economic value of the contract. Total fees paid under the agreement may be much higher in the long-term relationships. Fees payable may be riskier than fees actually paid because it can increase exposure beyond the revenue already collected. So the first step is not just identifying the number, it is identifying the basis of the number. What exactly is the cap built on? That question alone already makes your reading more serious. Then comes the second issue, and this is where many people make mistakes. The cap amount means very little if you do not also read the carve-outs. This is one of the most important points in the entire clause. A carve-out is an exception. It identifies categories of claims or conduct that are not subject to the general cap. or are subject to a different, often higher cap. A typical carve-outs may include confidentiality breaches, intellectual property infringements, data protection violations, fraud, willful misconduct, and sometimes gross negligence. Now, in theory, carve-outs can be perfectly legitimate, but in practice, this is where a seemingly reasonable clause can become much more dangerous. Why? Because you may think the agreement contains a standard liability cap, but in reality the most sensitive claims sit outside it. So, if the cap is 1 year of fees, but data breaches, IP claims, and confidentiality breaches are uncapped, then you do not really have one clear economic ceiling. You have a capped structure with major open exposure. That does not automatically make the clause unacceptable, but it means you need to understand what risk the company is actually keeping. And in a SaaS, that analysis has to be grounded in operational reality. For example, if the product processes personal data, a data protection carve-out is not just abstract legal wording. It may relate directly to how the platform works every day. If the software includes customer-facing features, integration, or third-party content issues, IP exposure may also be more than theoretical. So the right question is not only, are there carve-outs? The right question is, are these carve-outs aligned with risks the business can actually control, insure, and operationally manage? That is a much more mature way to read the clause. The first thing to examine is the exclusion of damages. Most limitation of liability clauses do not only cap liability, they also exclude certain types of damages entirely. You will often see exclusions for indirect, incidental, spatial, consequential, or punitive damages, sometimes also for lost profits, lost revenue, lost business, or loss of data. This is where legal drafting becomes deceptively technical, because these categories sound standard, but they are often interpreted differently across jurisdictions and disputes. So, when you read an exclusion of damages, do not just assume it solves the issue. Ask yourself what is actually removing from the claim landscape. If the customer says your outage caused operational disruption, reputational damage, loss of internal productivity, or missed commercial opportunity, which of those losses are excluded and which might still be framed as a direct damages? That matters a lot. A clause may look protective on paper, but still leave room for legal arguments if the drafting is vague or if the legal categories are unstable in practice. That is why strong contract review is never just verbal, it is conceptual. You are trying to understand what kind of claim still survives after the clause does its work. The fourth point is asymmetry. Is the clause truly mutual or only apparently mutual? Many clauses look balanced because both parties are subject to a cap, but once you read closely, the structure may be much harsher for one side than for the other. For example, a vendor may have broad and capped exposure for confidentiality, data protection, and IP, while the customer's payment obligations remain almost untouched by meaningful downside. Or the customer may demand indemnification rights that functionally bypass the cap, or one party may benefit from right damage exclusions while still preserving remedies that are economically aggressive. So you need to ask, is the clause symmetrical in form or symmetrical in economic effect? Those are not the same thing. This is where business lawyers become more useful than purely textual lawyers, because they look beyond formal reciprocity and ask whether the deal still feels proportionate. The fifth thing I look at is how the clause connects to the rest of the contract. That is absolutely essential. A limitation of liability clause should never be read in isolation. It needs to be read together with at least four other areas: indemnities, confidentiality, data protection, and security obligation, and termination or service commitments. Why? Because those clauses often create the very liabilities that the limitation clause is trying to govern. Take indemnities. If the contract says the supplier indemnities the customer for third-party IP claims, security incidents, regulatory losses, and maybe even broad misconduct categories, you need to know whether those indemnities are capped, separately capped, or uncapped. Take security obligations. If the contract contains aggressive promises about encryption, audit rights, breach response time, or compliance standards, then a carve-out for data breaches may become far more significant. Take also confidentiality. If the confidentiality obligation is drafted extremely broadly and any breach is uncapped, even minor operational issues may become high-stakes disputes. This is why reading the limitation clause well requires structural reading. You are not just reading one paragraph, you are reading the contract's risk architecture. Now, let me give you a very simple practical framework. When you read a limitation of liability clause in a SaaS contract, ask these 5 questions. First, what is the general cap and how it is calculated? Second, what claims are carved out of that cap or subject to a separate cap? Third, what types of damages are excluded? Fourth, is the clause economically balanced between the parties? Fifth, do other clauses in the agreement quietly recreate exposure that this clause seems to limit? If you ask those 5 questions every time, your reading will become sharper immediately. Now, from a business perspective, here's what really matters. The purpose of a limitation of liability clause is not to eliminate all exposure. That is unrealistic. The purpose is to keep exposure proportionate to the deal, predictable enough to manage, and narrow enough that the company is not unintentionally underwriting risks it never priced. That last point is especially important in SaaS. A recurring subscription model often creates relatively modest contract value compared to the potential harm a customer may claim after an outage, breach, failure, or integration or service issue. So if the revenue is limited but the downside is open-ended, the economics of the deal may simply stop making sense. And that is the kind of thing legal should be able to identify clearly. Not dramatically, not in a performative way, but just calmly, precisely, and in language the business can understand. For example, instead of saying like this carve out is problematic, you can say this structure exposes beyond the commercial value of the contract in areas where our operational commitments are already broad. If we keep these exceptions, we should narrow the underlying obligation or create a more controlled cap structure. That is much stronger because it connects legal analysis to commercial logic. And that is exactly what gives a legal professional credibility in a SaaS environment. Now let me end with one mistake that junior reviewers often make. They read the limitation of liability clause as a compliance checkpoint. They ask, is there a cap? And if the answer is yes, they move on. But that is not enough. A real review asks whether the cap actually functions, whether the exceptions follow the rule, whether the rest of the contract correctly rebuilds exposure, and whether the clause still makes sense once you compare it to the value, complexity, and operational reality of the deal. That is the real level of analysis. So, if I had to summarize this entire video, a limitation of liability clause is not just a legal safeguard. It is the clause that tells you whether the risk of the contract is still economically proportionate when the relationship stops going well. That is why it deserves real attention. The best contract reviewers do not just find the cap, they understand the real shape of exposure behind it.